Chinese military planners conducted war games in 2019 simulating an invasion of Australia, and the results were so catastrophic that Beijing classified the entire study. Not because Australian military forces proved unbeatable, though they certainly didn't make it easy, but because the geographic reality of invading a continent 7,000 kilometers from Chinese ports, across some of the most inhospitable ocean on Earth, into a landmass larger than Europe with virtually nothing in the interior to sustain an invading army, proved absolutely impossible with any realistic level of forces China could deploy. The tyranny of distance that isolated Australia for centuries from European conflicts now serves as the most effective defense system any nation could possess. And every adversary who's ever contemplated Australian invasion has reached the same conclusion. It simply cannot be done. Welcome to Doctrine of War, where we analyze the geographic realities that determine military outcomes before battles are even fought. Australia's geographic position represents one of the most defensible strategic situations any nation has ever enjoyed. Isolated by vast ocean distances from potential adversaries, surrounded by maritime choke points that any invasion force must transit, and possessing continental interior so harsh that even successful landing forces would face environmental challenges rivaling any defending army. Today we're examining exactly why geography makes Australia unconquerable, what specific geographic factors create this defensive advantage, and why modern military technology hasn't overcome these fundamental realities. And what you're about to discover is that Australia's greatest defense isn't the military budget or alliance commitments. It's the 7.7 million square kilometers of continent that no adversary can effectively occupy or control. The ocean moat, distance as defensive weapon. The single most important geographic fact about Australia is distance. Specifically, the enormous ocean distances separating the continent from any nation with capability and potential motivation to invade. Beijing sits roughly 7,000 kilometers from Darwin, Australia's northernmost major city. That's not just distance on a map, that's multiple days of transit through open ocean where invasion fleets would be completely exposed to submarine attack, air strikes, and all the hazards of maritime operations against a defending force that knows you're coming. To put this in perspective, the D-Day invasion across the English Channel required Allied forces to cross roughly 150 kilometers of water, and even that relatively short distance created enormous logistical challenges and operational risks. Australia's ocean moat is nearly 50 times longer. The logistical requirements for projecting military power across 7,000 kilometers of ocean exceed what even the United States military could easily accomplish, much less China or any other potential adversary. An invasion force large enough to conquer Australia, let's conservatively estimate 500,000 troops as the minimum necessary to control even the populated coastal regions, would require thousands of transport ships, hundreds of escort vessels, continuous air cover, and the most extensive amphibious operation in human history. The logistics alone would be staggering. Fuel for the fleet, food and water for troops, ammunition, heavy equipment, vehicles, medical supplies, and everything else modern military forces require. And all of this must transit multiple days through waters where Australian submarines and aircraft could attack at will. The sea lines of communication that any invasion force would require represent permanent vulnerabilities that defending forces can exploit continuously. Ships cannot hide in the open ocean. They're visible to satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, and naval forces with modern sensors. A Chinese invasion fleet departing mainland ports would be detected immediately by American and Australian intelligence, tracked throughout its transit, and targeted by Australian and Allied forces long before reaching Australian waters. The defending forces would have days of advance warning, allowing complete mobilization of reserves, positioning of forces to optimal defensive locations, and coordination with allies for reinforcement or support. The element of surprise that often determines amphibious operation success would be completely absent. The choke points that any invasion force must transit create natural kill zones where Australian and Allied forces could devastate attacking fleets. The strait passages through Indonesia, Sunda Strait, Lombok Strait, Makassar Strait, all represent narrow waters where submarines can lurk undetected, where mines can be laid, and where surface ships and aircraft can concentrate fires on forces that have no room to maneuver. Chinese naval planning understands these choke points represent extreme vulnerability, which is why Chinese strategy emphasizes controlling South China Sea and Indonesian waters before even contemplating operations against Australia. But controlling these waters against Australian and Allied resistance would itself require military operations of enormous scale and risk. The weather and environmental conditions in the oceans surrounding Australia pose additional operational challenges that favor defenders. The seas between Indonesia and Australia can be treacherous, with significant wave heights, tropical storms, and conditions that make amphibious operations extremely difficult. Any invasion would need to time operations for favorable weather windows, further constraining operational flexibility and providing defenders with predictability about when attacks are most likely. And climate conditions in northern Australia, intense heat, high humidity, tropical diseases, create environmental challenges for any military force, but particularly for invasion forces without established logistics and medical infrastructure. If you're starting to understand why the ocean distances surrounding Australia represent defensive advantages so profound that they make conquest practically impossible regardless of invading force quality or size, you're seeing exactly the kind of geographic analysis that Doctrine of War provides. We examine how terrain, distance, and physical geography determine strategic outcomes. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what we're about to reveal about Australia's continental interior geography shows why even successful landing would lead to strategic disaster for any invading force. The maritime domain awareness that Australia and allies maintain over approaches to the continent means that invasion fleet movements would be tracked in real time from departure through transit to landing. Australian surveillance capabilities include P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, MQ-4C Triton high-altitude drones, satellite coverage, and naval vessels that continuously monitor sea approaches. This surveillance network extends thousands of kilometers from Australian shores, providing a comprehensive picture of all maritime activity. Any fleet large enough to invade Australia couldn't possibly hide, meaning defenders would track every movement and predict landing locations with high confidence. This transparency means defenders can concentrate forces at likely landing sites rather than defending the entire coastline, creating local superiority even against numerically larger invasion forces. The submarine threat represents the single most devastating capability that defensive forces can employ against invasion fleets. Modern submarines, particularly nuclear-powered attack submarines that Australia is acquiring through AUKUS, can operate in enemy-controlled waters for extended periods, remaining undetected until launching torpedo or missile attacks that can sink transport and escort vessels. A handful of submarines positioned along invasion routes could potentially sink dozens of ships, killing thousands of troops and destroying equipment before invasion forces ever reach Australian shores. The historical examples are sobering. During World War II, Allied submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping, ultimately strangling the Japanese war economy and military operations. The Chinese invasion fleet transiting to Australia would face a similar submarine threat, but with modern weapons that are far more capable than World War II torpedoes. The air strikes that Australian and Allied air forces could conduct against invasion fleets would compound the submarine threat, creating layered defense that attacking forces must somehow overcome simultaneously. Australian F-35 fighters armed with long-range anti-ship missiles could strike from standoff ranges where Chinese air defense struggles to engage effectively. Long-range strike weapons launched from Australian territory could hit invasion fleets while they're still thousands of kilometers from Australian shores. And if American forces join the defense, which ANZUS treaty obligations and American strategic interests suggest they would, then invasion fleets face the full weight of U.S. Air Force and Navy strike capabilities. The combined air and submarine threat makes the transit to Australia a gauntlet that could destroy half the invasion force before landing even begins. The continental interior, Outback as ultimate defense. Even if an invasion force somehow survived the ocean transit and successfully established beachheads on the Australian coast, the continental geography would present challenges that make successful conquest impossible with any realistic force levels. Australia covers 7.7 million square kilometers, roughly the same size as the continental United States excluding Alaska. The vast majority of this landmass is arid or semi-arid interior that cannot support large populations or military forces without extensive logistics chains. Invading armies cannot live off the land, in Australia the way historical invasions sometimes sustain themselves in agricultural regions. The outback provides no food, limited water, and environmental conditions that are actively hostile to human survival without modern support infrastructure. The populated coastal regions where invasion forces would logically land represent only a small fraction of Australian territory, but even these coastal cities are separated by enormous distances of harsh terrain. Sydney to Melbourne is nearly 900 kilometers. Melbourne to Adelaide is another 700 kilometers. Perth sits over 2,000 kilometers from the eastern cities, isolated by desert that provides no military value but creates enormous defensive depth. An invasion force that captured Sydney would find itself no closer to controlling the rest of Australia than if it hadn't landed at all. Occupying Australian cities requires separate amphibious operations for each metropolitan area, each defended by forces with interior lines of communication who can reinforce more easily than the attacker can move between separate beachheads. The infrastructure deficit in interior Australia creates insurmountable logistics challenges for invasion forces. The road networks, rail lines, pipelines, power generation, and communications infrastructure that modern militaries absolutely require to function simply don't exist across most of the Australian interior. An invasion force that attempted to advance inland from coastal beachheads would find itself operating in an environment where every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every meal, and every spare part must be transported hundreds of kilometers over roads that in many cases don't exist. Building this infrastructure while fighting a defensive force that can strike supply lines at will would be operationally impossible. The defensive advantages of fighting on home territory multiply when the terrain actively punishes attackers while defenders operate from prepared positions with established logistics. Australian forces defending their own territory would fight from bases with fuel, ammunition, food, water, medical facilities, communications networks, and all the infrastructure that makes military operations possible. Invading forces would be operating from beachheads that are under constant attack, with supply lines that stretch back across thousands of kilometers of ocean that submarines and aircraft can interdict. Every day of operations would consume supplies that must be replaced through those vulnerable supply lines, creating an unsustainable logistics burden that no invasion force could maintain indefinitely. Population distribution poses another impossible challenge for occupation forces. Australia's 26 million people live primarily in coastal cities, but even those cities sprawl across enormous areas with suburbs extending dozens of kilometers from city centers. Occupying and controlling these urban populations would require massive troop commitments. Historical examples suggest at least 20 troops per 1,000 civilians for effective occupation control. Just the major metropolitan areas would require several 100,000 occupation troops, and that's before accounting for combat forces, logistics personnel, and reserves. An invasion force that captured cities would find itself needing even more troops to hold them than were required to seize them in the first place, creating manpower requirements that quickly became unsustainable. The guerrilla warfare that an armed civilian population could conduct against occupation forces would create an additional burden that conventional military forces alone couldn't suppress. Australia has relatively high civilian firearm ownership. Military service is broadly respected with a substantial veteran population, and the culture includes self-reliance and skepticism of authority that would translate into resistance against occupation. Unlike urban guerrilla campaigns in places like Iraq where insurgents operated among sympathetic populations in dense cities, Australian resistance could operate from the vast interior, striking occupation forces and retreating into terrain that attackers cannot effectively control. Historical examples from Afghanistan to Vietnam demonstrate that occupation forces fighting guerrilla resistance suffer continuous casualties, logistics disruption, and erosion of combat power that no amount of technological superiority fully overcomes. The scorched earth options available to defending forces make conquest even less appealing. Australia possesses infrastructure and resources that any invasion force would need to sustain operations and justify the enormous costs of invasion. But defenders can destroy this infrastructure, denying it to attackers while falling back to prepared positions deeper in the interior. Fuel depots, power plants, communications nodes, ports, airports, all can be demolished or disabled, forcing invasion forces to rebuild entire infrastructure networks while fighting a war. The prospect of capturing Australian resources becomes far less attractive when those resources would be destroyed or rendered inaccessible by the act of invasion itself. The time and cost required to conquer Australia, even if somehow militarily possible, make invasion strategically irrational for any nation. Wars must be won relatively quickly or risk economic exhaustion, political collapse, and intervention by third parties who want to preserve balance of power. An Australian invasion would require years of sustained operations consuming enormous resources with no guarantee of success. During those years, the invading nation's economy would suffer, its military would be tied down, unable to respond to other threats, and its international position would deteriorate as other powers take advantage of its distraction. The opportunity costs alone make invasion an obviously bad strategic choice even if tactical success were possible. The alliance factor compounds every defensive advantage geography provides. Australia doesn't defend alone. ANZUS Treaty commits the United States to Australian defense, AUKUS deepens that commitment, and Five Eyes intelligence sharing means allies would know about invasion preparations long before forces deployed. American military intervention would transform an already difficult invasion into absolute impossibility. U.S. Navy and Air Force capabilities would devastate any invasion fleet while it was still thousands of kilometers from Australian shores. Even without formal treaty obligations, American strategic interests strongly favor preventing hostile power from controlling Australia's geographic position commanding southern approaches to Asia. The combination of geographic defensive advantages and alliance commitments means potential adversaries face not just Australia's military but the prospect of fighting multiple great powers in defense of geography that massively favors defenders. The nuclear dimension provides ultimate insurance against invasion even in scenarios where conventional defense failed. While Australia doesn't possess nuclear weapons, the ANZUS Treaty and Australia's close relationship with both Britain and the United States create ambiguity about whether nuclear powers would use nuclear weapons to prevent Australian conquest. Would America use nuclear weapons to defend Australia against invasion? The doctrine is ambiguous, but the mere possibility creates deterrence that no conventional force can provide. More immediately, Britain and France possess nuclear weapons and both have indicated they view Indo-Pacific security as vital interest. Would they use nuclear weapons if Australia faced conquest? Adversaries cannot be certain. The answer is no, and that uncertainty creates deterrence that reinforces geographic defensive advantages. That's today's analysis of doctrine of war. If this examination of how geography makes Australia unconquerable gives you new appreciation for the defensive advantages that distance and terrain provide, let us know in the comments. Could modern military technology overcome these geographic barriers? What would an invasion of Australia actually require in terms of forces and logistics? And if you want more analysis of military geography, defensive strategy, and the physical realities that determine conflict outcomes, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're covering the strategic factors that matter more than weapon counts or defense budgets. The tyranny of distance that once isolated Australia and limited its global influence has been transformed by modern circumstances into the most formidable defensive advantage any nation could possess. While other countries invest billions in fortifications, missile defenses, and standing armies to defend relatively small territories against nearby adversaries, Australia enjoys a natural moat of thousands of kilometers combined with continental interior that cannot be occupied or controlled by realistic invasion forces. This doesn't mean Australia can ignore defense or assume geography alone provides complete security. Modern military capabilities require constant investment, alliances must be maintained, and deterrence requires demonstrating will and capability to resist aggression. But it does mean that Australia faces fundamentally different strategic calculus than nations vulnerable to rapid invasion or occupation by neighboring powers. Geography has made Australia secure in ways that no amount of military spending could replicate for nations in more exposed positions. Until next time, stay strategic.